we can speak to Andreas Krieg, an associate professor at King's College London. Thank you for speaking to France 24. First of all, how should a head of state like Emmanuel Macron, who's running for re-election in the spring, weigh strategic interests versus human rights violations?
Hi, good afternoon. That's a very good question, but this entire trip to the Gulf is very much geared towards a domestic audience. I think this has been really in the run-up to the presidential elections next year. Macron knows that domestically he hasn't done very well. So this is all about kind of buying credit externally. The funny thing is, though, as he already said earlier, I mean, he seems to be prioritizing geostrategic interests over human rights, and he's done that throughout the course of his presidency, because we've seen across the engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, France under Macron has taken strategic interest or has prioritized strategic interest more than human rights. Their engagement with the UAE in Libya, for example, their engagement with the UAE in Yemen as well, have all been about geostrategic and security interests, not really about human rights. So it's not really surprising that Macron going to Saudi Arabia now is also, again, prioritizing geostrategic interests. And the thing here is France is obviously trying to redevelop its image as well as its position on the world stage, and doing so in the Middle East and North Africa without actually cherishing values and human rights, which kind of undermines France's position in the wider international community, I think.
What would that mean concretely? I mean, there's this tricky balance of power in the Gulf amid the bitter rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So what are Emmanuel Macron's goals concretely for this trip?
I mean, they're multifold. I mean, one is obviously advancing French defense interest. And, after losing that very strategic, very big submarine deal with Australia, obviously the French defense industry is very much interested in new contracts. And he was able to secure one contract with the UAE, which is very significant. 19 billion euros is quite massive to sell particularly fixed wing aircraft to the UAE. Apart from that, it's obviously he's trying, or has been trying throughout the presidency, to kind of rebuild a new strategic or security framework in the Middle East as the Americans are withdrawing. But obviously France is a middle power. It's not a major superpower. It doesn't have the leeways, it doesn't have the leverage, it doesn't have the networks to actually bring all these parties together. We've seen Macron trying to play a role in Lebanon, which is, again, where the Saudis used to play a very pivotal role. And I think some of the negotiations today or the discussions that they have in Saudi Arabia are about Lebanon. But here again, France hasn't been able to deliver. When it comes to North Africa, actually, France has worked with the UAE against the UN-backed government and has undermined it. Thereby, again, France has undermined its position within the EU as well as undermined its position within the UN. All of that to trying to make France great again. I think there's a very strong populist element to this, where Macron is trying to position himself as a leader in the Western world, a leader in Europe who's actually being proactive rather than reactive, while countries like Germany, for example, have no real strategic interest or leverage in that part of the world, and the Americans seem to be withdrawing, and Britain seems to be preoccupied with Brexit. But obviously, France can't go it alone, and the partners that France is choosing here, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have quite big question marks when it comes to values and human rights.
And these arms deals that you mentioned, they play well back home in terms of jobs and the economy, but do they really provide peace or stability for the Middle East?
No, and particularly not with the UAE. The UAE over the last couple of years have been one of the most divisive and disruptive players in this part of the world. They have engaged with hard power in Yemen, with hard power in Libya. They have done so without actually really a great strategic objective in mind. They've done so with no regard for human rights. They've committed war crimes. France has helped that campaign, particularly in Libya, which was destabilizing Libya post the revolution, as well as destabilizing the UN-backed government. Again, France is on the side of the UAE here. Selling arms to these kind of partners is obviously kind of boosting and bolstering authoritarians in the Middle East. And France has been very much strongly on the position of authoritarian stability. I think Macron has taken a position of saying post the revolutions, post the Arab Spring, France is backing the counter-revolutionaries and the authoritarians. And I think that is in short-term thinking, it might deliver short-term security and stability. But in the long term, I think repression and authoritarianism is not there to stay and will just lead to more instability, more insecurity. And bolstering that through arms deals is not necessarily a long-term strategic goal.
All right. Thank you very much for your analysis. Andreas Krieg from King's College London.